So I propose to continue a little bit more on the track of Sri Lankan poetry in English, the New Guard, which I spoke about in my last interaction. Um, and what I hope to do is maybe draw attention to the poetry scene as a whole, but more with the purpose in mind to draw attention to some endemic problems that I find in it, ailments, so to speak, or drawbacks, if I may call them that. And also maybe open our discussion how, in practical ways, we can address or counteract some of these drawbacks. So, starting off, I would like to first of all bring to the fore a kind of a conception that exists about Sri Lankan English poetry. This is a conception you come across when you talk to poets, people who write poetry, as well as people who run publishing enterprises, publishing houses, publishers, as well as people who own bookshops, booksellers. The conception is that in Sri Lanka, English poetry doesn't have a market, that it doesn't sell. This is what you hear. So you speak to colleagues who compose poetry, you talk to people who are interested in looking for new writers to be published, as well as managers in bookshops. They say poetry doesn't sell. If at all, the poetry moves very slow. Now, that observation, I would like to place it side by side with a second observation I would like to make. And the second observation is that there is a big commitment in Sri Lanka, a big bent, a slant towards the composition or the production of poetry. There are so many people who write poems. Quality or measurement aside, the fact that poetry is coming out is a visible reality. So you go and check out blogs, maybe web-based publications, e-zines. You log on to Facebook and go through the material of people who write and share stuff on Facebook. You see, poetry is very forthcoming. And if you want a slightly more, let's say, scientific, for the absence of a word, a statistical example, I did a cursory reading through the Gratian Trust website where they have the archives outlining all the Gratian Prize finalists ever since the prize was initiated in 1993. And if you look at the finalists of the last 15 years, 2005 to 2019, you find no less than 17 poets who have made the final shortlist in those years. So this is definitely more than one poetry finalist per year. And if you kind of scan through that list of poetry finalists, there are household names, some very established writers, but also emerging poets, emerging writers who kind of break through perhaps the Gratian Prize and then go on to other things. Whether they actually publish their work is a different issue, because the Gratian Prize, unlike some of the other literary prizes in Sri Lanka, it entertains manuscripts. So there are people who contest the prize in manuscript form. It is expected or it is encouraged that they publish then after. That seems to be the logical next thing to do, but there is no guarantee everyone does. But for me personally, in terms of credibility, transparency, and quality of the assessment you get, the Gratian Prize is definitely the top prize in Sri Lanka. So this reading that I get out of the Gratian, that there are 17 people who are good enough to make the Gratian shortlist, it is a kind of a barometer reading regarding the creation process, the production output of poetry in the country. So poetry is there, but the problem seems to be at the next level. Uh, Pushing this poetry as publications, quality assured publications, getting them out into bookshops, getting readers engaged, creating reader interest, and also, of course, the uh, hopefully the pinnacle of this process would be the critical reception of these works. So if you kind of map those second and third tiers of that flow chart, in the second tier you have people like publishers, bookshops involved. So these are the people who make it happen, make the book come out, stream it into a space where people can come, browse through, maybe buy a book, take it home. And then, of course, the third tier, where you have the kind of discursive spaces involving critics, maybe involving academics, reviewers, the kind of critical dissection, putting back together of these works, which then become a part of our cultural discourse, our cultural exchange. So, personally, being in publication for about 15 years and being a writer who has four published collections of poetry, there are problems, as I see it, in the second and third tiers, the publisher bookshop phase of things, and the then after, the critical reception, the kind of phase where the poetry gets converted into a cultural reception of sorts. Now, one thing I have realized is that Sri Lankan bookshops, and I shouldn't generalize, what I mean by bookshops here are conventional minded bookshops who kind of sit quite safely and comfortably on their laurels, do very little, in my experience, in terms of the promotion of literature and making people engaged proactively in consuming the literature. In my understanding, in my experience, most bookshops in Sri Lanka, they are mainly like storage spaces for which we have to pay as writers, so that we can have our books stocked up, where you hope a reader would come and, from some dingy, dust-ridden shelf somewhere, would actually get your book. And if that reader can survive whatever asthmatic consequences of that fishing out of the book, they will take it home. So, very little, as I understand, is done by the way of promotion, by the way of getting the word out there. Even when a buyer comes into the shop, very little is done to kind of connect the writer with the audience. Mm, I have, as a kind of a result of not being very happy how this process is handled, actually ceased to deal with mainstream bookshops since 2017, because in any case, I had to traditionally invest a lot of my energy and time in promoting my own work, even though it is in display in a bookshop, and still pay a certain amount to that bookshop owner. So, with the advent of social media, with new channels making the readership more accessible to you as a writer, and given the fact that I'm a small writer, uh, I have in the last 3 to 4 years actually taken up promoting my own work, dealing in sales direct, and I would like to channel this as a point that proves the lethargy and the anemia with which bookshops deal in sales. Uh, the sales that I do on my own with my effort, it has resulted in a 12% increase of whatever sales that used to happen before 2017, before I took it on myself. So I'm not encouraging people, I'm not telling everyone to take this as a bailout plan, but this is just to identify how much more that interim player, the seller, the promoter can actually do in pushing literature, poetry, or whatever. And then, of course, the third phase. Because one thing I have realized, as someone who has been corresponding on literary and social themes to the media, someone who has been engaged in reviewing Sri Lankan work, both in my blog as well as in other spaces. If you take the last 10 to 12 years, there is a steady backslide on the critical culture that used to be at one point very vibrant in newspapers, magazines, and so on. So this is something that is kind of happening at the same time, simultaneously happening with the greater availability of media. So it's a kind of a paradox because now suddenly media is quite widespread. There are new avenues coming out, but the critical intervention, the critical push given in receiving literature, it has steadily gone down in my assessment in the last 10 to 12 years. So in the last video I did, I was referring to one instance where when Vivi Marie van der Putten published her second collection of poetry, there was a strong kind of a critical backlash against Vivi Marie on her style, on stylistic grounds. And I don't know whether this was intentionally done, but on the long term, perhaps it helps the writer to actually take a step back and view your own craft, what you are actually doing. But even leaving that aside, that presence of a critical culture, it kind of gives a third dimensionality to that production process of literature, which is lacking. So also something I have noted, especially people coming out of the academy, maybe people with a critical onus, people with an ability to engage critically with literature, whose opinions and views, if channeled into across a newspaper or shared on a web domain, would actually help the literary discourse as a whole. They're becoming steadily few and far in between. So this is something ideally I would like to see changed in encouraging a critical discourse, and also in a way of banking or investing more on promotion, visibility, availability. I would like to suggest that we have to undertake the task of creating new discussion flows for literature in Sri Lanka. The English literary scene is very much narrow. It's not as widespread as the Sinhala literary scene. As an industry, it is still very much in the infancy. If you take the resident or the local discourse, it is not even an industry to begin with. That's why in the last 30 years, with the rise of globalism, expatriate writers, people living outside Sri Lanka, living closer to the first world production desks, being patronized by transnational big publishing houses, they have basically walked over, steamrolled resident writers. There are even academics who look at Sri Lankan writing from outside, who actually take the expatriate branch of Sri Lankan writing as the be-all and the end-all. So for example, Lisa Love, one of these academics you often find quoted in articles dealing with Sri Lankan writing. She has this article called The Sinhalese Diaspora, New Directions in Sri Lankan Diasporic Writing. Lisa Love kind of says something like this about Sri Lankan writers in English. She says that these writers are mostly educated in the West. Many also live in the West. And they show in their writings an ability to live between East and West literarily and intellectually. So Sri Lankan writers in English are mostly educated in the West. Many also live in the West. So you see, that's how distant the resident writer across all forms is from the international critical lobby, because they don't have that visibility. They don't have that visibility because even locally, their material doesn't get communicated, it doesn't get transmitted to the to the readers. So we have to change this flow. And I have a feeling the next 2 3 years, I'm actually it's I've already started on it. I'm trying to see how I can contribute to encouraging small literary communities, which would actually take up not-for-profit, non-goal literary festival type. This is strictly not-for-profit. This is strictly for literature. You create small platforms where writers can come, they can meet other writers, they can share their work with people, readers, consumers who would like to come there. And the kind of long term, mid long term plan I am looking forward to is create a steady flow of such platforms across the year. So, trying to bridge the gap between the writer and the critique, bringing them nearer to that middle tier where it's all about getting the work out, getting the word out, and getting people meaningfully engaged. So I think Sri Lankan English poetry is definitely a resource that is in hiding for various reasons. Sri Lankan English poetry right now, this present moment, the last decade, the decade we are heading into. So there are people who are producing in virtual domains who might perhaps need a little bit more encouragement to go ahead and put their work out. Perhaps the prevailing condition, because of the way publication is done, the way bookshops kind of float, hover in that ethereal space, these might be discouraging factors, but these have to be counteracted and make more and more writers, more and more potential poets actually have their work available in print form.